an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Rule of Wolves, chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23. In these chapters, I was so sure David was going to be okay, and you guys don't even know what it was like to start this chapter with the sentence that it starts with. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Joanna for commissioning this episode. Except, I hate you. But, oh well, what can you do? So, this chapter 20 starts with, they stood on the shore of the lake at the little palace watching David's body burn. I will just say, I wasn't ready for that. I just wasn't. I really thought David would be okay. I really thought he would wind up like terribly injured. Something like pretty extreme, but that he would still be alive. And I'll tell you why. Because Genya has already been through so much that I didn't expect the author to be willing to do this to her. You know what I'm saying? Like, Genya has just really drawn the short straw a lot of the time. And it is unfair, but this is something that I have seen with various people in my life. And that I'm sure people have like heard about secondhand about others. But sometimes you'll run across a person that just seems to have like a shadow over them their entire lives. And they just do nothing but suffer hardship and loss repeatedly to a point that feels like mean-spirited. I have an aunt like this. And it was the kind of thing where, like, she did make some bad choices, but also she made a lot of those bad choices because of the terrible luck she had been dealt so early in life. And it just sort of fueled everything to the point that, now, she is suffering from Alzheimer's, so things have kind of come to a standstill for her. But it just seemed like she could not catch a single break. And then the Alzheimer's sort of coming in and hitting as hard and as fast as it did was like the final blow for me of just being like, what the fuck? What did she do to deserve all of this? And that's one of those things that is just part of why everyone wants to know, is there any meaning behind any of this? You know, because you will see that sometimes. A person that genuinely was trying their best, getting shit on over and over again, while somebody who seems like a piece of garbage will get ahead and get breaks one after the other. And it really, we want to believe that there is like rhyme or reason behind that. And maybe there is, but if there is, it's on such a big picture scale that it doesn't feel like it at all in the short term, you know? So, David's death, it was just, I just really didn't think he was going to be gone. And starting off this chapter with his funeral, it was such a shock. I'm so glad that I didn't accidentally listen too far last episode. Actually, I did, but what I mean, I should address that also. I'm just glad that I didn't accidentally listen to the first sentence of this chapter and spoil myself that he was really gone. But when I say I didn't listen too far, I actually did. And so I underread for this episode a little bit. Last time I thought that I was meant to read through Mayu's chapter, but I was actually supposed to stop at Mayu's chapter. So I underread a little bit for this time, so that things will sort of even out, because the episodes are being pre-purchased and I don't want to wind up like ahead or behind too much. But man, y'all, this is going to be a sad episode. I'll tell you that right now, because there's a lot of like awful shit happening. So it's the funeral, and Zoya is doing that thing so many of us do, where we wonder what people will say about us at our funerals. And she is standing next to Genya, helping keep her upright, because Genya is genuinely feeling like there's too much to stand, this like grief and pressure. And Nikolai steps up, and Zoya is expecting him to give like a very kingly speech. But instead, he is genuinely emotional and grief-stricken. And he describes David's like, desire to do the right thing with the gifts he was given, imagining him like in the afterlife in some library. And then Genya has to step up. And I'm listening to this and thinking the only thing that I could think to say if something happened to Owen was, I loved him. And that is the first thing she says. And I was just devastated by that. Like, this is the kind of thing that I'm like, Lee Bardugo, have you lost somebody? Or is it just that easy to imagine losing them? Because I'll be honest, I think about what I would do if I lost Owen too much, probably. And it's the kind of thing that I do in a way to sort of prepare myself, because I feel like the other deaths in my life came as such a shock that I felt totally unprepared. And yet, you can't prepare yourself for this. It's just not possible. But it's a form of attempting to control things that I am just very, very good at. So, I loved him and he loved me. When no one could reach me, he saw me. Genya turned her head to Zoya's shoulder and sobbed. I loved him and he loved me. Ugh, you guys. I hated this. So, Genya asks Zoya to go ahead. And Zoya has a moment of looking at Genya and thinking about what her mother would say about love. This is what love does. It had been one of her mother's favorite sayings. When the larder was bare, when her husband couldn't find work, when her hands cracked from taking in the neighbor's washing. This is what love does. My mother warned me I would have no life with a Suli, that she and my father would turn their backs on us, but I didn't care. I was in love. We met by moonlight. We danced to the music his brothers played. I thought love would be our armor, wings to fly with, a shield against the world. She gestured to the meager home, the cold stove, the piles of laundry, the earthen floor. Here is our shield. This is what love does. Her father had said nothing. And for some reason, that line, her father had said nothing, it didn't even occur to me he was around when her mother would talk like this. But that really adds an extra layer of like gross cruelty to it. And Zoya remembers seeing her father's, his brothers once, and how different they looked. They were not beaten down. They were not like cowed. And they offer to take him away. And it's clear they do not like his wife. And it's interesting to know that they used to play music for them to dance by. But now, they think that she is just toxic for him, which she clearly was. She was going to sell her daughter, and then when he says, I have a child, they're like, well, then just bring her with you. And Zoya immediately thinks, take me away from here. Zoya had clapped her hands over her mouth as if she'd spoken the words aloud, released some kind of curse into the world. Guilt flooded her, choking her, bringing tears to her eyes. She loved her mother. She did. She did. She didn't want anything bad to happen to her. She didn't want to leave her alone to fend for herself. She'd crept back into Sabina's bed and hugged her close and cried herself to sleep. But she'd dreamed she was riding in a Suli wagon, and she'd woken the next morning confused and disoriented, still sure she could smell hay and horses, still certain she could hear the happy chatter of sisters she didn't have. She'd never seen her uncles again. Love was the destroyer. It made mourners, widows, left misery in its wake. Grief and love were one and the same. Grief was the shadow love left when it was gone. And this is the kind of thing where, it's not a lie. Grief and love are one and the same. I mean, that is the truth. But when you try and separate yourself from people so that you don't experience love because you don't want to experience grief, what you do is invest yourself so completely in a painful future that you sacrifice your present for it. And that's your decision to make, but it doesn't seem wise or like the point. Unfortunately, life isn't about avoiding pain. That's just, and that's not to say that all pain is like virtuous and good or born of love, because that's certainly not true. But trying to simply live to avoid pain is a fool's errand. And it's a really good way to divorce yourself from the best parts of what life has to offer. And I just have never really seen the sense in it in the end. There's deciding that you are going to embrace what comes and enjoy things while you can, and then embrace the pain that may come from that. And then there's a decision to keep your life as stark and empty as possible so that you don't experience that pain later, which just feels like you're bringing that pain forward and experiencing it sooner, just slightly different form. So, yeah, this just got to me a little bit. So Zoya steps forward. I used to believe there was one kind of soldier, the kind of soldier I aspired to be, ruthless and unrelenting. And she talks about generally how she had resented Genya and David, and how she thought she knew everything, and that David was so different and he listened, and Genya showed kindness and what that could do. And then everybody is grieving. So many people have lost somebody because of this attack, and we are going to fight back, not for revenge, but she says, not driven by revenge or rage, but by a desire to know more and do better. And we will, just as we grieve together, we'll face this new enemy together, side by side. So then we have this notebook that Genya opens and says, I need to go to him one last time. It's a journal that David kept. Ideas for compliments. Hair, color, texture. Smile, causes and effects. Talents, tailoring, tonics, sense of style. Inquire on style. Teeth, size of feet. I just, like I made my feelings on these types of planned compliments clear, but also this is like adorable, I can't be mad at this. And she walks out and puts the notebook on the pyre with his body and says, so you'll remember when I meet you in the next world. And Zoya is just like able to hear her because of this ability that she's gained, but she doesn't want to. She doesn't like being able to intrude on it. And she thinks to herself, how do you survive a world that keeps taking? There was no answer from the dragon, only the crackle of flames and the cold silence of the stars, lovely, bright, and uncaring. And that is a really good sentence. How do you survive a world that keeps taking? Like, I am a very privileged, lucky person in that I have experienced so much less in that regard than a lot of people. And even I feel the weight of that. And I can't imagine how much worse it is for folks who have gone through some serious trauma and life experience. And we keep going. And it's sort of mystifying why. So they go and meet the king. And they're in the sitting room, not really sure what to say. And finally, it says there had been funerals held all over Osalta in recent days, once the danger had passed. The king had attended as many as he could, slipping into churches where prayers were spoken to the saints, helping to move families out of areas of the city that had become unsafe. Zoya had seen little of him since she'd returned to the capital, and she was glad of that. Facing him would mean facing her failure. Instead, she'd tried to help make sense of the chaos that had followed the bombings, setting up new protocols for blackouts across Ravka, lodging formal diplomatic protests with Fjerda, joining the Grisha in the lower town to help with cleanup and rescue efforts, grateful to be busy. And what we find out later is that she feels like Nikolai isn't like making eye contact with her, that he hasn't been as available to her. And then when we are in his head later, he feels the exact same way about her, and each of them thinks that the other is judging them for their perceived failure. But they are not. That's not what's actually happening. And this is the kind of thing that is so dangerous. It's like assuming that you know why somebody is doing the things that they're doing, or even assuming that they are doing those things to begin with, but when she does confront him about it, we get a look in his head at what his answer would have been if he had been able to speak freely. And I was like, ooh, that's a good line, but I'll get there. So, Tolya asks, who else was hit? And we hear we lost half our flyers, most of our airships, and our stores of titanium are gone. And Zoya is watching him deliver this news, realizing that he has a look of defeat in his eyes that he has never had before. And they can't comprehend because, the whole thing with using titanium for the shells that they were going to make, the missile shells, was that titanium is strong and light and very easy for squallers to manipulate and aim at quite a distance. But if they're too heavy, they won't be able to do that. And this is when Nikolai says something about, I think Fjerda may hold back. They attacked us in the hope of intimidating the West and getting them to declare for Vadik Demidov. It's a strategy the Darkling used. And she says, he got the best of me again. And she's thinking about how she could deal with rage, she could deal with sorrow, but shame, she does not know how to cope with that. And they just talk about what could possibly happen to switch things, because they're wondering whether he is going to join up with the Fjerdans, or maybe, and she thinks, should we have found a way to forge an alliance with him? And it's just how could any of us have worked with him after everything he did to all of us? And when they talk about him joining up with the Fjerdans, there is a sort of like suggestion that perhaps because he had done that once before, the Darklings went and joined with Fjerda. I don't know if you remember that from a previous series, but the what's his name? The Apparat, he is with the Fjerdans now, and he had sort of declared himself so against the Darkling that they're like, well, the Fjerdans couldn't accept the Darkling and keep the Apparat on their side. But then Nikolai says the Apparat survives. If he senses the Darkling can become a valued asset, we can be sure he'll have a sudden epiphany. And coming back from the dead makes for a very grand entrance. And Genya says, I don't think the Darkling will join the Apparat. The whole thing with getting the Apparat on his side was so that he would support the Darkling. And instead, the Darkling got somebody who turned on him and supported Alina. And there's just no way he's going to forgive that. He doesn't do that. He doesn't take people back in when they have betrayed him. That's that. And she says that the Darkling and the Apparat both have in common how much they underestimated everybody. So then we have Nikolai talking about what we're going to do. And he says, what we do next will determine not only what kind of war this is, but what every war will look like after. Launching a rocket without ever needing to put a soldier or pilot in harm's way, war is meant to have costs. At what point are we as bad as the Fjerdans? And Genya says, David hated making war. He was an inventor and a creator. But he also knew we couldn't forge peace alone. The Fjerdans have shown us who they are. It's up to us to decide who we want to become. And who is that? Zoya asked, because she truly didn't know. All she'd ever had was anger. We build the rockets, said Genya. We make them understand what we can do. We give them a choice. And then Nikolai, when they say something about like, well, we need the titanium first, he says, oh, we'll get it. I happen to know someone who can help with this particular kind of negotiation. And I am really, really hoping that we are about to get Kaz Brekker mixed back in with this shit and that he is going to help them steal some stuff, because that would be very fun. Because he has to steal it from Ketterdam. So, yes, please. So then we go to chapter 21, The Monk. And it's really funny because it's called The Monk, but we're really much, much more in the Darkling's head for this. And there's little surges of Yuri coming through and like asking questions, demanding things. But mostly it's the Darkling's thoughts and his like weird, twisted understanding of what it is that he has done and sacrificed, and he just really does not see the fault in anything that he's done, really. And he's thinking about the questions that Alina had asked. Why do you have to be the savior? The answer to her question was as obvious as it had always been. But he says that, but then her questions had troubled him and gotten under his skin. It's not obvious, dude. Like, you think it is and you're convincing yourself it is, but it's not. And his shadow soldiers carried him through the forest and glade as his mind wandered until at last he arrived in a town by a river. And he sees it and he sees all of these like weapons and is just like, the tanks and flying machines that had overwhelmed this world were new to him and unwelcome. Had his plan succeeded, had he managed to weaponize the fold with Alina by his side, Ravka never would have been vulnerable to this march of brutality. And I'm just like, dude, how can you made the fold. How can you fault this brutality over your brutality? And he goes into this town and he looks like shit. So people are kind of giving him the eye a little bit. And he decides that he is going to go by the name Alexander. That is the one that he decides on, his oldest name. He saw a small church capped by a single whitewashed dome. Through the open door, he glimpsed the priest tending to something by the altar as a woman lit candles for the dead. So he steps in, and all of a sudden he realizes that he had come back to the church that had been raised over the ruins of the home of Ilya Morozova, Alexander's grandfather, a man thrown to his death from the very bridge Alexander had crossed on his way into town. And he turns into shadow and pulls away so that the priest doesn't see him, and then goes down the stairs. I say he turns into shadow. He fades into shadow, but I don't know that he can turn into shadow at all. I don't think that's really a thing. And he goes looking for this hatch, and it says, when he pulled on the metal ring, the hinge let loose a shriek. Yuri rattled in his skull at that little bit of sacrilege, but Alexander ignored him. He lowered himself into the room beneath the basement. Here, the floor was dirt, and the lantern showed nothing but earthen walls, roots trying to push their way through, but he knew what this room had once been. The workshop at the back of Morozova's home, the place where his grandfather had tampered with the boundaries between life and death, had resurrected creatures with the hope of building power into their bones. So this is when we hear about Bagra laughing herself sick when they come back to this town and she sees the church that's been built. And she's just horrified. She's just I cannot believe that the very people who killed him, they're out here celebrating him. She says, real power frightens them. They want the illusion of it. An image on a wall, silent and safe. So he finds these, let's see, the niche where he'd found the journals, empty now. No, not entirely. His fingers fastened around something, a piece of wood, part of a child's toy, the curving neck of a swan fashioned with exquisite care, broken at the base, useless. And this is just, him actually digging through the past in a very literal way. And he's thinking, Yuri keeps sort of pressing him about Alina in his head and being why did you go to her? And we find out that the Darkling didn't even know for sure that this was going to work with the Thornwood. He was hoping it was going to work, but he wasn't totally convinced of it and just had to do his best. And then he thinks about the blight. And it says he had to admit that it was partially his fault. Though if the boy king had been good enough to lie down and die as he was meant to, the Obisbaya would have been completed and the fold never would have ruptured. But how terrible could it be? Ravka had been through worse, and so had he. So saying the fold ruptured is interesting. I don't know if anybody had referred to it in that way, but he is saying that the fold ruptured because the Obisbaya was interrupted, I guess. I mean, that I accept it. I'm not going to argue with it, but it's sort of an interesting thing that I want more information about, and I don't know if I'll get it. It's not hugely important to understand it exactly, but I would like to know. So he's about to go back upstairs. He finds these journals, and he hears a bunch of people out there. And realizes that maybe there's the congregation has come for prayers for this evening. And he uses his powers to sort of create this oh, I said that he found the journals. I'm just realizing now the niche, the journals are gone. And it's just that child's toy is the only thing there. I wonder if that is useless. I'm curious. I don't know. But, okay, so he decides to create this sort of display for the people in the church upstairs. And it says, from his hiding place behind the door, he raised his hands and focused on the painted icon behind the priest. Slowly, shadows curled from Sankt Ilia's open hands. They began to bleed from his mouth. A gasp went up from the congregation. The priest turned and fell to his knees. Alexander drank their fear and wonder. Heady as that cheap cherry wine he'd had in... he could not quite recall. He gusted through the church, disguising himself in a whirling cloud of shadow, and the congregants screamed. Alexander couldn't simply appear again, resurrected. There were too many old grudges, and there would be too many questions. No, there was a better story here. He would become Yuri. Let the boy do the talking for him. And when the time came, the monk would be his chosen one, a boy who came from nothing, endowed with great power. They'd loved Alina's little fairy tale. They'd love this one, too. He would go to the fold. He would find those who followed the starless saint. He would teach the world awe. And that is the end of his chapter. So that, using Yuri, I'm very curious about it since Yuri looks so different. And people are like, how is he going to handle it if people know what the Darkling looked like and those folks are still alive? They're going to recognize him. So I'm not entirely sure how he's going to manage that part. Or if it will just be a sort of a trick with shadow that he'll do. I don't know. But anyway, okay, so then we go to Nina's chapter. And Nina, we start like, a couple days ahead and then sort of step back in time a bit. But we find out that the attack that happens on Ravka is announced like in the midst of a party. And their success is something that everybody is like celebrating wildly. And she is so horrified by hearing that they like bombed an area that had straight up civilians in it, that she like is physically sick. She winds up managing to get out of the room in time and vomits and takes to her bed and claims that it's like something that she ate. But truly, she's just overcome with so much guilt because she knows that she saw a map with some of the plans for this attack, but she simply didn't understand what she was looking at. And she keeps thinking, like, if I had known, I could have done something. And a part of me is like, I don't know if you could, Nina. Like, it seems as if it had already been set up by the time you saw those maps. I don't know if sending a note would have even gotten there in time. I don't really know how that works, I don't have a good concept of the timing of everything. But before we quite get there, we have this moment that, let's see, I'm trying to find the spot where the Carl Broom and this other guy are talking about the prince. Here it is. So she'd been with the Brooms in the ballroom. Word had spread that Prince Rasmus had not been permitted to join the hunt, but the damage was somewhat tempered by reports of how handsome he'd looked in his riding clothes and how much stronger he seemed every day. We'll see, Broom muttered. Patting the shoulders on his jacket won't make him any more a king. The grizzled Redvin had merely let out a snort. Let's get him up on a horse and see what happens. That's cruel, Hannah had said. You mock him for his weakness and then punish him when he dares to change. And Redvin claims that she has a fondness for him. And Broom says, there is no punishment for a prince, Hannah, and you would do well to remember it. Rasmus may favor you now, but if his opinion turns sour, I will be unable to protect you. And I gotta say, as much as I don't like Broom, he is not wrong about that. Being next to a prince, a king, a queen is all well and good when you are on their good side. But if they suddenly decide they don't need your ass anymore, good luck to you, because there isn't anything anybody can do to like mitigate shit and not lose their own place. So then this is when they get interrupted and Nina hears and has to like try to play along that she's happy, but then manages to like get out of there. And she is just like the horror of being amidst people celebrating all of this, combined with how blindsided she is by it. And this feeling of sort of self-loathing that she has at how she was, as she puts it, playing at spy while all of these people were fucking dying. It's just a lot. It is a lot. And she tells Hana to make the prince weaker, make him sick. And she's asking for an explanation, and Nina is just like, please just do it. Like, I don't have the energy right now. I am losing it. But please just trust me and make him sick. And then there's a couple of days that pass with her really struggling. Nina can't eat. She's like sleeping, but not quite. And then she hears Broom talking about how the queen is demanding to see her, and he doesn't care whether Nina is sick. The queen is going to get what the fucking queen wants to get. So she manages to make herself like, she gets herself ready, but then she asks for Hana to tailor her. And she says, I want to look saintly. And what Hana does, her skin shone like polished marble, a faint rose petal flush on her cheeks. Her hair gleamed silvery blonde. She looked like she'd been dipped in moonlight. You really have been practicing. Hana looked almost guilty. Quite a bit. On myself. Why does the queen want to see you? Her son's health is failing. And that was when I got it. I was like, I didn't understand her saying make the prince sick until this moment. And then I was like, it's meant to be like a result of what they just did. So they wrap her up in like a dressing gown and a shawl to cover her hair to sort of keep it from being too obvious how like great she looks when she's supposed to have just been ill. And they leave her with the queen. And on the way, she asks a question of Lenore, the woman who was the midwife that got killed and buried in the like churchyard nearby. And she comes in, and the queen is like, do you need to see my doctor? And Nina says, what good has your doctor ever done your son? Which is a really bold way to start shit out. And then we get an answer, because I had said, like, the whole thing, what about Jill's children? And I hadn't understood the significance of it, but I theorized, like, is that supposed to be the Grisha? And it turns out that is what some people call the Grisha, are the children of Jill. So she was, like, planting that seed as well. So when the queen is like, I don't understand, I've been praying every day, but my son just keeps getting worse. She says, the war has angered Jill. It was a Grisha who saved your son and brought him Jill's blessing. The bombing was a great military victory for Fjerda. And Nina says, do you know what stands between the Grand Palace and the Little Palace in Ravka's capital? The Royal Chapel. The site of the first altar where the first prayers to the first saints were said. A false religion. But the reply was slow, tentative. This was where Fjerda rained fire. That was Jarl Broom's directive, not my son's. Do you not rule this country? Was it not done in the Grimsure name? In Gerholm they whisper that Grisha are the children of Jell. Finally, she'd made the leap. Jell is a good father. He protects his children, just as any loving parent would. And the queen starts to say this is heresy, and Nina just says, I can't explain these things. And just as the queen starts to call her unnatural and a heretic, Nina lets her eyes roll back and begins a litany of like accusations and memories, and talks about Lenore in the dungeons who came to help. You promised her freedom, but you never intended to set her free. And then she sings the song that this woman apparently like sang to the queen when she was having trouble sleeping, to help her fall asleep, and mentions how, oh, she also told you that she had a little girl. She had a daughter that you promised she would see again. The queen released a sob. I needed her help. Jell forgives you all of it. I don't, thought Nina. Your tree god is far more magnanimous. But he will not forgive the murder of Mor Gracia, not when your son owes his life to one. How am I to stop it? Our people want war. Is that what you've been told, or what you know? Your generals want war. The people want their sons and daughters to live. They want to sleep in their beds and tend the crops in their fields. Will you listen to your generals or to Jell? The choice is yours. And she turns around to leave, and the queen says, I can't, like, how dare you turn your back? And Nina's like, the one who should be worried about turning their back is Jell. And then she leaves, and she can't tell whether she's gone too far or whether this is going to work, but it's too late. She's done the best she can do. So let's see. Earlier, she'd been too bleary to make sense of what she'd heard Broom say outside her room, but now the word rang through her head. Drakestering. The Druskel would be in the woods tonight, far from the ice court, celebrating the sneak attack on Ravka. This was her chance to break Magnus Opshare out of the Druskel sector. Ravka was bleeding, and she was powerless to undo the damage their enemies had wrought. But Nikolai Lantsov still lives. That meant there was still hope. She could deal Fjerda a blow and maybe give her king a small advantage in this fight. It was time to make some trouble. And then the last of the chapters in this section. Nikolai. So he wakes up. Well, he had never fallen asleep. He's in bed tossing and turning, and he finally stands. And he had sent a message to Ketterdam, but there's, nothing to be done except wait until they reply to him. So he tries to work, but everything that he works on has David's notes, and it just keeps on interrupting his mental flow and causing him to just get drowned in sadness. And finally, he just goes over to the window and looks out, and there's snow on everything. And he had sent word to Tamar to see if she could find out if the Shoe Queen had known about the bombing, if the Shoe and the Fjerdans had come together to forge an alliance against Ravka. But he didn't think that was the case. Maki had her own agenda. She'd seen Ravka as weak, and she'd moved to claim it through subterfuge before Fjerda could claim it by force. If not for Isaac's courage and Fate's love of a good plot twist, the Shoe Queen might have done just that. But while Maki had failed with a scalpel, Fjerda might well succeed with a hammer. So, I don't know. I really thought that she would know. They don't need to be allied for her to maybe know. But I don't know. Maybe they do. They probably wouldn't tell her if they weren't a straight up ally. So he looks down in the garden and he sees Zoya. And this is not the first time that he has seen her heading out late in the night by herself. He hadn't let himself think too much on Zoya's late night excursions. He hadn't wanted to. If she had a lover, it was none of his business. And yet, his mind spun possibilities, each somehow worse than the last, and he keeps coming up with people that she may have, been coupling up with. And before he can stop himself, he is dressed, and he is, going out, telling his guards to just wait. And he follows her into the woods, thinking to himself that he really shouldn't be doing this. She has a right to privacy, and he damned well didn't want to find her in the embrace of another man. So she is following a wall on the gardens. And she pushes aside this like pile of vines, and there's a door in the wall that he didn't know was there. This is all very a secret garden. And she leaves the door open behind her because she has known that he was there the whole time. Which I do enjoy because he thinks he's being sneaky, but he doesn't fully understand the level to which her power and like perception has increased since this like weird thing with Joris. So it's understandable that he overestimates his own sneakiness. And I love this. He couldn't help but take offense. That Zoya had kept secrets from him was no surprise, but that the palace should? I thought we were past that, he muttered. I do like that. So there were 2 stars carved into the wood of the door, just like the stars in the mural in her rooms. 2 small stars painted onto the flag of a storm-tossed boat. He'd never asked what they meant. So he passes through and he realizes that this is the old vegetable garden that he thought was like completely abandoned. Because they moved all of the like gardens and stuff closer to the kitchens. Whatever this place had been, it was something very different now. There were no tidy rows of cabbages, no orderly patterns of hedges favored by the palace gardeners. Willows bordered the paths like women bent in mourning, their branches shod in ice and brushing the soft white ground like strands of hair. Flowers and shrubs of every variety overflowed their beds, all of them white with frost, a world made of snow and glass, a garden of ghosts. Zoya had lit lanterns along the stone walls, and now she stood her back to him, her figure still as an ornamental statue, as if she'd been part of this garden all along, a stone maiden waiting to be discovered at the center of a maze. And she says, I'm running out of room. When my aunt was killed, and I came back to the little palace to fight the Darkling, I needed some place to be alone. I used to walk in the woods for hours. No one bothered me there. I don't remember when I found the door, but I felt as if my aunt had left it here for me to discover, a puzzle for me to solve. I plant something new for every Grisha lost. Heartleaf for Marie, you for Sergei, Red Sentinel for Fedyor. Even Ivan has a place. This will blossom bright orange in the summer. I planted it for Harshaw. These dahlias were for Nina when I thought she'd been captured and killed by Fjerdans. They bloom with the most ridiculous red flowers in the summer. They're the size of dinner plates. Now she turned, and he could see tears on her cheeks. She lifted her hands, the gesture half pleading, half lost. I'm running out of room. This was where Zoya had been sneaking off to all those nights, not to a lover, but to this monument to grief. This was where she had shed her tears away from curious eyes, where no one could see her armor fall. And here the Grisha might live forever, every friend lost, every soldier gone. I really like this, the idea of a secret place that you can go and honor the folks that you have lost and truly grieve away from the eyes of everyone. It's the kind of thing that I think a lot of us, especially folks who live with a lot of family or roommates or have kids, the ability to really let yourself cry becomes harder and harder as you get older, because sometimes you straight up feel like you don't have the time for the luxury of just letting yourself cry. Because there's a real sense of, if I let myself start, I don't know when I stop. And then there is I don't want anyone to come and comfort me. I don't want them to even know. I just want to have this grief alone. And if you cry and anyone can hear you, they're going to try and inquire. There's just like no avoiding that. But sometimes that's not what you want. You don't need comforting. You need privacy. you need a release that is just for you. And the fact that this is like so far away from the palace and it's just in such an odd spot, and she goes at night, there's just so little chance that anybody would stumble across it. And I really envy her this space. And I am in a much better position than a lot of people for allowing myself to cry, because I'm in the house by myself a lot of the day and I don't have children. Owen will be off at work. But the thing is, it's been twice that I've let myself really cry. And both times Owen has come home in the midst of it. And it has made me kind of loath to try again, because it's hard to get somebody who loves you to believe that you don't need anything from them when you are letting yourself cry like that, you know? That is not to say that Zoya is in that position here, because she definitely needs something. She says to Nikolai, I know what I did was unforgivable. And he's like, wait, what? What do you mean? And she's like, the Darkling, don't fucking pretend that you've been avoiding looking at me ever since I came back. And then we have this beautiful thing that's been underlined by a lot of people. I love this so much. You've barely looked at me since I returned, because I am greedy for the sight of you. God, that's a good line. Because the prospect of facing this war, this loss without you, fills me with fear. Because I find I don't want to fight for a future if I can't find a way to make a future with you. But he was a king and she was his general, and he could say none of those things. I'm looking at you now, Zoya. You need never ask forgiveness of me. He didn't want to tie himself more closely to the man she hated, but he also didn't want there to be any secrets between them. I sensed it when the Darkling broke free. The demon knew somehow, and for a moment I was there in the room with you. Zoya said, I wished you'd been there. You do? Now she looked nothing but annoyed. Of course I do. Who else would I rather have my back in a fight? Nikolai struggled not to break out in song. That may be the greatest compliment I've ever been paid, and I was once told I waltz like an angel by the lead dancer of the Royal Ballet. Maybe if you'd been there. Her voice trailed off, but they both knew Nikolai wouldn't have made a difference in that particular fight. If Zoya and the Sun Soldiers couldn't stop the Darkling, it wasn't possible for him to be stopped. And he looks around, because she says, do you see what grows around this place? And it's a thornwood. I took the cuttings from the tunnel that leads to the little palace. It's all prickles and spines and anger, covered in pretty useless blossoms and fruit too bitter to eat. There is nothing in it worth loving. How wrong you are. Zoya's gaze snapped to his, her eyes flashing silver, dragon's eyes. Am I? Look at the way it grows, protecting everything within these walls, stronger than anything else in the garden, weathering every season. No matter the winter it endures, it blooms again and again. What if the winter is just too long and hard? What if it can't bloom again? He was afraid to reach for her, but he did it anyway. He took her gloved hand in his. She didn't pull away, but folded into him like a flower, closing its petals at nightfall. He wrapped his arms around her. Zoya seemed to hesitate, and then with a soft breath she let herself lean against him. And then he says, then you'll be branches without blossoms, and you let the rest of us be strong until the summer comes. It wasn't a metaphor. Of course it wasn't. And they just stand there together with his arms around her. I was so hopeful, I really was, that there would be a kiss. At the same time, There absolutely cannot be, and they are both far too serious about their roles to allow themselves that. But I really wanted it anyway. It's like one of those where I just... this is what's gotten me in so much trouble in my life, is I always want to do the more interesting thing instead of the more intelligent thing. And like, look, it has led to quite an interesting life, but sometimes doing the interesting thing is also the more hurtful thing, or the more destructive thing. So, yeah, this moment is just... there's so much here. I am greedy for the sight of you is one of my favorite lines ever. I love it so much. So they left the garden and walked back through the woods. On the path they parted as they always did, she to the Grisha and he to the grand palace. He wanted to call her back. He wanted to follow her through the snow. But his country didn't need a heartsick boy chasing after a lonely girl. It needed a king. And a king they will have, he said, to no one at all, and strode back to the dark rooms of the palace. And that is the end of his chapter. Look, it's not like we haven't gotten a sort of like love story that never wound up, an unrequited love, because we did get that with Kaz and Inej. The two of them aren't able to like be together really, and while there's still a sense of like potentially one day in their story, it doesn't feel like it's soon. It doesn't feel like that's something that can be expected, to happen within the next couple of years. It's like the kind of thing that they will both have to work towards for quite a while. And they would need extensive therapy probably. So we have had this kind of like unfulfilled romance. But this, I just cannot accept that they won't wind up together. I can't do it. They have to. I ship them so hard. I don't do this kind of thing. You guys know. Shipping is just not really something I get that invested in. But if these two do not wind up finding a way to be together, I will riot. I will lose my mind. I just need to make that very clear. Because what's so frustrating is that the fact that he needs an alliance is so correct. It's so true. And with everything going on the way that it is, it's understandable that it would be more important now than ever for him to take that shit seriously. Marrying Zoya and her becoming a queen would be of no advantage in any position in this war. It would not change anything. It would not make her more like, she is already a leader. She's a general. She's already doing everything that she can. And I can't think of a single thing that would make marrying her helpful. But there just doesn't seem to be anybody who's even like slightly interested in an alliance with him to the point of marriage now. There were people who had come to the court before, but one of them was planning to assassinate him. Another was like, they were already scheming behind his back. Fjerda was. And there's just a lot that remains sort of in the air. I don't really know if there's something that could be done with like the Suli or, I don't know enough about the rest of the politics in this world, but I don't feel like the Suli would be a helpful ally in particular either. I just don't know. I really can't imagine a scenario in which they wind up together, other than him somehow not winding up being king. And he's a really good king who cares and is smart. And I need him to stay as king. So I don't want to give that up either, you know? It's just the kind of, there's a no-win situation for me because of how much I love each of these characters. When Alina gave up her power and just decided to live a normal life, I was relieved because Alina was fucking not cut out for what she was doing. She couldn't handle being a saint. She couldn't handle the power and going up against the Darkling. Like, it was killing her. It really feels like, in retrospect, it's being treated like a kind of victory, but for me, it felt like, in the moment, not a defeat, that's too strong a word, but it felt like a relief for her to let go of what she had been in order to have her anonymity and ability to live an ordinary life. Neither Zoya nor Nikolai hungers for an ordinary life, except in that it would allow them each to be with each other. That's the only reason why. So, what possibly could happen to allow them to be together? I just can't imagine. Finding out that Zoya is surprise, a queen somewhere? Like, you know, truly, is that anything? I don't, that's not a thing. Like, if it became a thing, I would be like, really? Come on. A secret queen. She's so famous now, too, that if she were, that shit would have come out. You know? I don't know. So, yeah, I'm going to wrap. But these were very moving chapters, and I am just so devastated about David. I really, really am. I was not ready. Why did she do this to me? All right, guys. Until next time. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.